Cheryl Lampard here. Welcome to Knitter Matters. We've just come in a bit early because I want to make sure that the live is happening. I've got my iPad here so I can hopefully be able to see when you post any questions. I'm not seeing anything at the minute. Let's see what's happening. I don't know why. I can't see it on the iPad. Let's go back to the page. Anyway, that's the whole point of coming in early. And I hope you're all well this week. I hope your weather is pleasant. Posts. So that should... Why can't I see that? Oh well. Anyway, it's 7 o'clock now, so we will start. Anyway, welcome indeed to Knitter Matters. This is season 2, episode 19, and thank you so much for joining me. Whether you're watching live or the replay later, I'm really glad to have you, and I do appreciate you taking that time. If you could just let me know that you can hear me okay, that would be wonderful. I shall carry on the assumption that you can until somebody tells me differently. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm a style and image consultant with my company Style Matters International. But throughout my life, I've had two passions, which are sewing and knitting. And knitting in particular is the thing that I do every day. It's my relaxation, it's my therapy. I just love it. And I know that you do too. And I used to be the proud owner of a yarn store in Brighton, England many years ago. And one of the great joys of owning a yarn store is that you get to be able to teach people how to knit. And I loved teaching people how to knit then, and I think I even love it more now, especially on the platform of social media, where I can actually reach more people and introduce them to the delights of this wonderful fibre art. I can see that you can hear me, so that's wonderful. Anyway, now I'm going to try and say hello as the names pop up, but I'm not able to actually see you there now for some reason. But where I can, Lorraine and Nancy, somebody is kindly writing down your names for me. If you do have questions, do put them in the comments thread. I will get back to you as soon as possible afterwards and answer any questions that you may have, particularly if I can't answer them as we go along. Okay, now if you're a regular viewer, you might notice again that I'm not in my usual studio in Naples, Florida. Last week I was in downtown Philadelphia, and this week I'm still in Pennsylvania, but in a more rural setting, and it's absolutely glorious out there. The sun is still shining, the birds are singing, and it's really lovely. Anyway, I'm going to ask the camera to move to the tabletop so that we can get on with part 2 of Mosaic knitting. Right, so last week in part 1, we looked at the basics of Mosaic knitting. I'm going to bring out these samples again because we looked at these. And just to recap, Mosaic knitting is a colour work technique. It's using one colour every 2 rows. So you're not carrying the yarn across the row and you're not twisting it in the way that you would carry the floats across for Fair Isle, and you change colour as you go, and you're not twisting it as you would for Intarsia. And you're also knitting, or in this case, you're purling. Well, actually, yeah, you're purling and knitting in that one. But that's the point. You're knitting or you're purling and you're slipping stitches in the same row. Now, you also carry the yarn up the side of the work. There's no, you don't cut off the yarn each time and rejoin a colour, because you're keeping one colour for 2 rows, then you change colour. So you can actually run the colour up the side, which is so nice. You don't have a million ends to sew in afterwards. Now, crucially, you're working 2 rows to create each row. I'll say that again. You're working 2 rows to create each row. If you were with me last week, you'll know what we were doing, but don't worry about it. I'll be going over that as we go through the patterns. Oh, and Jill has joined us. Thank you so much for joining us, Jill. Now, if you find, I'm going to show you some, I said this week we'd do some more advanced mosaic knitting, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So these 2 samples here, they're actually, they follow the same pattern. We're using 2 colours for each row, 1 colour for 2 rows. We're using knits and purls and slip stitches, and that's all we're doing, really. Now, what I've done here, I've done the same design, but I've done one in stockinette stitch and 1 in garter stitch. And if you find a design you like, you can do either in stocking stitch or garter stitch, but just you need to take account of how different the finished fabric is. And look what I mean by that. You can see here, this one is taller, this one is actually shorter, and it's wider. And what I have done here, I've done 3 pattern repeats across the width on both of them. I've done exactly the same thing, 3 pattern repeats across the width, and I've done 3 repeats in height. But the fabric is quite different. This is slightly more flexible. I mean, this is flexible too, but it's a bit thicker. It's just the nature of the fact that we've done stockinette stitch, which obviously it's 1 row knit and 1 row purl, and here it's every row is knit. So you can see that if you play about with the pattern, you can certainly do the same pattern, but if you're making a garment or specific size items, you're going to have to adjust for that if you choose to do either garter stitch or on a stockinette stitch pattern or vice versa. So until you're really sure what you're doing or you've practiced it, please, check what your pattern says to do. But I really like this garter stitch version. To me, it captures the whole idea of mosaic knitting, the sort of stepped geometric shapes, which you can really see well here. And it also reminds me, coming from England, it reminds me of Elizabethan buildings in the UK and Tudor brickwork. It reminds me of that. So I said just now we're working 2 rows to create each row, which means that mosaic knitting charts are a bit different from regular knitting charts. And I must tell you that most mosaic patterns are charted because you can convey an awful lot of information visually rather than a lot of written instructions that can be confusing or hard to follow. And I know some of you don't like charts, but really I want to take the fear out of that. But there is something that we'll need to know specifically about mosaic knitting charts. This is Barbara G. Walker's Mosaic Knitting book, which I absolutely love. It's got hundreds and hundreds of amazing designs. And I mentioned last week that Barbara G. Walker is the lady that coined the phrase mosaic knitting in the 60s. I think she took inspiration from some tiles that she saw and started from there. Anyway, this is the chart from Barbara G. Walker's book. And this pattern, this is the one we're going to be following. I just want to talk to you a bit about this. So you'll see here, this is an 8-stitch repeat. Now you can have in many multiples. You can have 8-stitch repeats, you can have a 4-stitch repeat, an 8, a 12, a 16, 20, or whatever the pattern says. But you're always going to find extra stitches either side, and they're very important. But when you start the row off, and I will be showing you this, it's once you've got that first stitch done, you're going to be repeating this, the 8-stitch repeat in this case, but it could be something else. And then you finish off with the 2 sort of extra stitches at the end. They're very important, so you need to account for that. And many patterns will tell you what the multiple is plus however many stitches. So for my samples, for these samples, these were multiples of 8 plus 3. So I cast on a total of 27 stitches here, 3 times 8 plus 3 stitches, okay? Now, let me just show you something, because this is important. If we can see that without me. Yeah, we can see that. In fact, let me move the book. That's going to be easier. Which way does the camera want me to be? This way, right. So on a regular knitting chart, you nearly always start on the right hand bottom corner, which we are going to do that with mosaic knitting, but there's some extra things that we need to remember. So if you don't like charts or they frighten you, please don't be afraid. The symbols are to designate different stitches. You're not going to have to worry about what the symbols mean in a mosaic chart. You're just going to get dots or a colour or a plus sign, whatever. You're not going to get all these. These relate to something else. What I wanted to show you here was that we start... Can I ask the camera to pan up so we can see the bottom right-hand corner, please? So you would start bottom right hand corner and you would read from right to left on right side rows and left to right on wrong side rows. And that also means that the right side rows, assuming you're starting on a right side row, which is the usual case, that those would be odd numbers. So you would read from right to left. Then row 2, when you turn your work round or whatever it may be, you're going to, yes, obviously if you're knitting in the round, it's quite different, you just keep going. But if you're knitting in the flat, you turn your work around, that would most likely be a wrong side row, and you're going from left to right. So that also means that right side rows are odd numbers, wrong side rows are even numbers. Because that's the way we knit. We knit from right to left and we go upwards, okay? Now, in mosaic knitting, because each set of 2 rows repeats the same pattern, most mosaic charts are only going to show you 1 row to represent 2 rows. So in Barbara's chart, we start again at the bottom right hand corner and we go from right to left. So we would do this one, we do our 8 stitches, repeat that however many times we need to, then we do these. But on the second row, our wrong side row, we're going to use the same row because we're actually following the same stitch template. We might be doing a purling row here, or we may not, but we're going to be doing exactly the same pattern. We're not changing that pattern on the second row. So when we get to the third row, and again, these are still numbered so that right side rows are odd numbers and wrong side rows are even numbers, but the way it's shown is row 3, it's also row 4. On this one, I'll just bring back this sheet again. You can see quite clearly that our numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Here, it's 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. So that I can show you properly as I knit it, what I did do is to, if we could just show this chart here, please. I plotted this out so it was easier for you to see, and it's also a good representation of the pattern here. And I will be following this one because you'll most likely have patterns, mosaic chart patterns will just show you the 1 row that is 2 rows. So it's 1 and 2, 3 and 4. And I coloured this in so it's going to be easier for you to see when I knit it. See how good I am to you? But actually, okay, I'll come back to that in a second. You might also come across charts. If we can pan out to show this one, and if you can show both together, that's great. Another representation of the chart is that you may see it in its form with row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5. So each row has been plotted out for you there. But as you can see, it's not such a good representation of the pattern. This is the pattern that's how it's going to look. So if you will, that's what we did there. This is how it is stretched out. Now, you may find a pattern that is done like that. You need to know that before you start, because if that kind of looks a bit distorted, but if that's the way it's plotted out, you don't want to be then doing row 1 and 2, row 3 and 4. Your pattern will be completely wrong. So you must be sure before you actually start knitting what the designer intended. So, you know, the simple thing is you have to read the instructions really clearly and carefully before you start. So, let me show you how to read this chart. I'm going to be using this one because that's what you'll come across most often, okay? And I'm going to demonstrate how to work it. So, just back to a point a minute ago, you're most often, because I was good to you and coloured that in, you're most often going to see them just with black dots or a cross or something. And often mosaic patterns will refer to dark and light colours because they are often done like that. That's where you get the contrast. That's where you get the wonderful sort of mosaic effect. But let's say you're doing something not in high contrast, you're doing maybe two colors of a similar value, but they're different, so you're going to get a softer overall effect. If your brain has to think which is my dark color and which is my light color, that might be confusing. So what I would suggest then is if you can scan your pattern in and just print it out, then you can maybe highlight the differences with exactly as I've done with just fine felt tip pens, or use a highlighter pen, something like that, whatever works for you. Just a little tip there if you're doing not high contrast colors. Okay, so let me show you what we do. So most mosaic patterns have a couple of startup rows. Okay, I've just done, I'm going to ask the camera to, well, we're going to start with the stockinette stitch version, or stocking stitch version. So I'm going to get my contrast color there. I don't like knots, as you know, so I'm just going to start off with, can we see okay? Yeah, good. Okay, I'm going to start off here with my contrast yarn. So this would be my dark color, but as you can see, I've colored it orange or rust, which is what I'm doing. So my first row is going to be, I knit 3. Okay, let's give that a tug. I don't like knots, so just have to make sure that doesn't come too loose. Now, remember what I'm doing here, if you were with me last week, this is when we did the slip stitch. This is my slip stitch color, this white blank square there. And we're always going to be slipping purlwise. For mosaic knitting, we're always slipping purlwise. So I'm slipping purlwise. Now I do 1, 2, 3. Let's give that a tug again. I'm slipping 2 this time. Now what you want to be sure is when you're slipping, certainly when you're slipping 1, but certainly when you're slipping 2, you don't want to pull that tight. Well, you're not wrapping you don't want to make that tight. We want that to be nice and sort of flexible. So not too loose, but just, it helps sometimes if you tend to be a tight knitter, just stretch your stitches out a little on the needle. And when you slip, I'm going to go back just to show you, don't slip 2 at a time. Don't do that, it'll mess up the spacing in terms of how much yarn is used up. So always slip 1 at a time. So now you can see I've finished my first, I've done my first stitch, I've done my first 8 stitches. And I'm not going to do these 2 yet. I go back to between those lines because this is the repeat. So now I'm going to do 2. I'm going to slip purlwise. Now I do 3. 1, 2, 3. Slip 2. Now as it turns out, I'm at the end of my row because I did less stitches so that you wouldn't have to watch me endlessly knitting to the end of the row. Now I do these last 2 here. So now I'm turning around and now I'm doing a purl row. We're keeping our yarn this side and we're replicating the stitches exactly as they are. Remember, this is row 2, I'm following this row again. So this is purl, purl. I slip purlwise. Can I just see what we're seeing here? I can't see why my hands are, so I'm relying on the cameraman to look after that for you. It's purl, purl. You slip the same stitches again. So whatever color you're using, and we're using the rust color, that's what's in your right hand, that's what we're doing. So if you slipped those white stitches or whatever, your contrast stitches on the way, on the first row, you're going to slip them again. We're going to purl, and again, make sure you've got a little bit of play in that yarn there. Purl. So I don't even follow the chart actually on row 2. It's much easier if you don't, because you just know that's a white one, that's a contrast, that's a slip. If you slipped it on the first row, you're going to slip it on the second. We're going to purl, purl, slip, slip, purl, 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 slip, and purl, purl, purl. Okay? I don't even have to look at the chart for that. I'm just following what I did the first row. I'll just do another couple of rows on this one, then I'll show you how to do it in garter stitch. So that's our very first 2 rows. Okay. Let me do what will be row 3 now. This is where I'm changing to my light colour yarn. So now I'm knitting. Okay, remember I'm always knitting if it's my right side row on this case, and purling when it's my wrong side row if I'm doing stockinette. So I'm knitting, I'm knitting. Now I'm slipping my rust stitch. This is always a bit confusing to start off with. No, I'm not. Oh yes, I am. I am slipping that one because I'm working with the light colour yarn. So my next one, my next stitch, I am knitting again. Remember, whatever, if you forget where you are, one of the useful things is just to, I know it seems odd to say you forget where you are, but what colour have you got in your hand? That will help you because you're always going to start off your row with the colour that you're supposed to be using. Okay, so if you kind of, you know, a bit lost or you didn't use a row counter, if you've got the light colour in your hand, it's because you've started off with that. If you haven't started off with that, then you're either on the wrong row or you're using the wrong colour. Okay, so I've done 2. Now I slip my rust colour. Now I'm going to knit that. I slip another rust one. I knit another white one. I slip another white one. And these are 2 knits. As you carry on, the pattern becomes clearer. So that's my first 8 stitches. I'm going to go back to that first one for the repeat. It's a knit, it's a slip, it's a knit, it's a slip, it's a knit, it's a slip, knit 2. Now I'm at the end of my row, so I'm going to knit those 2 there. Now I'm turning round, it's row 4. I'm still on my light colour yarn, so it's purl those first 2. Remember, I'm on row 4 now. I've also got to purl the next 2. Now I've got to slip my rust yarn. I purl the next one, I slip my rust yarn. It was slipped on the first row, on the row 3 I should say, so it's slipping on row 4. I purl, I slip, I purl, I purl, I purl, I slip, I purl, I slip, I purl. And I'm not even looking at the chart, I'm just following what I've done previously. I slip, I purl, I purl. Now you can see, it's much easier as you get along because you can start to see the pattern really forming then. Okay. Now I'm going to show you how to do that with garter stitch. Okay, I'm just going to cut my rust yarn off because I only have one ball of that. I need it for the other. Okay, so we're going to follow the same idea, but we are doing garter stitch. Okay, so row 1, this is always going to be knit, but we have to do something a bit different on the wrong side rows for garter stitch. So first row is my first stitch, then I go into the repeat pattern. Now I'm going to slip 1, I'm going to knit 3, I'm going to slip 2, and you do those one at a time. Back to my first of the repeats. It's a knit, it's a knit, it's a slip, 3 knits in my rust, 2 slips and 2 rust colour knits. Again, exactly as we just did. Now this is where it's a bit different. So on my purl row, remember we're not purling now, we're doing garter stitch. So that's okay. I'm still going to follow the template of colours and slip stitches. So my first 2 stitches are knits. Now remember, when we are doing garter stitch, our yarn is at the back, so I need to bring the yarn forward and I need to slip those 2 stitches, then take the yarn forward again. So I'm knitting my rust stitches, I bring my yarn forward, I slip that one, bring the yarn back again. The yarn's always got to be at the back of my work here when we're doing garter stitch. So I'm knitting the rust stitches, I've got to bring it forward again, slip, slip, bring my yarn back again, knit, 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 and go forward again. I'm not following the pattern here, I'm just following what I've done before. But don't forget to bring your yarn forward and, if you will, sort of wrap it round again, because otherwise you're going to end up with wrapped stitches at the front, which you don't want. Knit, knit, knit. I'll do two more rows so you can really see the garter stitch start to fall. And that is the only difference. So you can see quite clearly my slipped stitches here. They're not wrapped in any way. That's not what we want. Okay. Now I'm on row 3, so I'm changing colour. And this is where we just bring the yarn up the side. So it is knit, knit. Now I need to slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, knit. Back to my first of the repeat. Knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, knit. And the last 2 of that row are 2 plain ones. So again, let me go. This is row 4, and on what would be a purl row, but it's not because we're doing a garter stitch mosaic, it's going to be a knit row. So we must remember to bring our yarn forward and back. But you don't have to worry. This is the great thing now. You just follow what you've done before. Okay, so where you knitted on the row, the odd number row, the right side row, you're going to knit those on the wrong side row, and you're going to slip the ones that you slipped before. The only difference being you've got to bring your yarn forward. Slip that, yarn back again, knit, forward, slip, back, knit. The more rows you do, the more you see the pattern forming, the easier it becomes. Slip, yarn forward, yarn back, around the slip one. Knit, 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 bringing my yarn forward, slipping it, bringing it back again to the back of the work, knit, bring it forward, back again, knit, bringing it forward, back again. Sorry, bring it forward, slipping that one, yarn back, and that is that row finished. And you just keep doing that. Now, I do suggest the more you go up with your pattern, let's move that out the way. If you find it easier, the next row, of course, would be number 5, and we would then change to the rust colour again. If you find it helpful, use a row counter. I'm all for row counters. I'm all for using row counters, or just mark it on a piece of paper, or you can just, you know, tick your chart as you go up. There's nothing wrong in doing that either, whatever works for you. But remember, you're doing, you don't have to, it might seem complicated, but honestly it's not. You just have to remember, take your time with it, you just have to remember that you're doing 2 rows in the same colour, and you're repeating the template of stitches on your return rows, on your even number rows, as you did. It's exactly the same stitch pattern, whether you're doing it knitting it or purling it, that the actual template is the same, and you only change colour at the end of the row, and it's always at the same end, so that's why you can carry the yarn up the side. And that's what I did here. So it's really quite simple. You haven't got hundreds of ends to sew afterwards. And however complicated the pattern, and these are more complicated than we did last week, the basis of all mosaic knitting is the same. And if you can do what we've done last week and today, you can do really any pattern for mosaic knitting. Okay, so I'm going to ask the camera to come back to me. I really hope that has whet your appetite for mosaic knitting. So as always, and do let me know, feel free to ask me any questions during the week. I'll be happy to answer them, but I'd love to see if you get on with mosaic knitting. It's once you get going on it, it's wonderful. It's really fun to do. I love it, and you get such interesting stitch patterns and colour contrast. It's fabulous. So I'd love to see your work if that's whet your appetite for having a go. I know that was a lot with the charts and everything, but really you just take your time and remember that it's 2 rows that create 1 row. So your mosaic chart will usually be charted that way, but do make sure you read the instruction. Okay, I will sign off now. If you're looking for this again in the replays, which will be uploaded to this page and our YouTube channel within 24 hours, it's season 2, episode 19, and it's part 2 of mosaic knitting. I really hope you enjoyed that. I hope to see you again next week, and in the meantime, stay well, stay safe, and stay knitting. Bye for now.